Why the Turkish economy is collapsing. A $500 billion lesson in economic delusion. The opening hook. Imagine you wake up one morning in Istanbul. You walk to your local bakery to buy bread. The same loaf you bought last month for 10 lira now costs 15. Your salary? Exactly the same as last year. But here's the kicker. You're not surprised. You're not even angry anymore. You're just numb. Because this has been happening every single month for the past 3 years. Welcome to Turkey, where the currency is worth less than the paper it's printed on, where a PhD-holding doctor earns barely more than minimum wage, and where grandmothers are lining up at currency exchange offices not to travel, but to survive. This is the story of how a president declared war on mathematics, how an entire nation became a live experiment in what happens when you ignore every economist on the planet, and how Erdoganomics turned one of the world's fastest-growing economies into an inflationary nightmare. Buckle up. This is going to be painful and expensive. 1. The man who hated math, how Erdogan declared war on interest rates. Let's rewind to 2018. Turkey was doing pretty well. The economy had been growing at breakneck speed since the early 2000s. Istanbul was booming. Foreign investors were pouring money in. The Turkish lira was relatively stable. Life was good. Then President Recep Tayyip Erdogan had an idea, a brilliant idea. An idea so groundbreaking, so revolutionary, that every economist in the world simultaneously facepalmed. He decided that high interest rates cause inflation. Let me repeat that. The president of Turkey, leading a G20 economy, publicly declared that raising interest rates makes inflation worse, not better. He called interest rates the mother and father of all evil. He said the central bank raising rates was an act of treason. Now, if you've taken even one semester of Economics 101, you know this is like saying the cure for a fever is to set yourself on fire. It's not just wrong, it's the opposite of reality. Every central bank in the world fights inflation the same way. You raise interest rates, you make borrowing expensive, you cool down the economy. It's boring, it's painful, but it works. Erdogan said, "Nah, I'm good." And he meant it. Where does this come from? 2 places. First, his Islamist background. In Islamic tradition, riba, usury or interest, is forbidden. Now, most modern Islamic scholars agree that reasonable interest rates for banking are fine. But Erdogan, he went full fundamentalist on this one. Second, and this is where it gets dark, Erdogan subscribes to conspiracy theories. He talks about the interest rate lobby, a thinly veiled reference to a shadowy cabal of Jewish financiers supposedly trying to destroy Turkey. Yes, really. This is economic policy driven by religious dogma and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. What could possibly go wrong? 2. The purge, when you fire everyone who disagrees with you. So, Erdogan has this theory. The problem? His central bank didn't agree with him. The central bank governors kept trying to do their jobs. Fighting inflation by raising rates. Erdogan's solution? Fire them. Between 2019 and 2024, Turkey had 7 different central bank governors. 7 in 5 years. Let that sink in. The most important economic institution in the country became a revolving door. Every time a governor tried to raise rates, Erdogan would fire them and replace them with a loyalist who would do what he wanted, cut rates. In late 2021, when inflation was starting to rise globally due to COVID and supply chain issues, every central bank in the world started raising rates. The U.S. Federal Reserve raised rates. The European Central Bank raised rates. Even Argentina, the inflation champion of the world, raised rates. Turkey cut rates. From 19% in September 2021, Erdogan forced the central bank to slash rates all the way down to 8.5% by February 2023. While inflation was climbing past 50%, then 60%, then 70%. The result? The Turkish lira went into freefall. It lost 44% of its value in 2021 alone. By October 2022, inflation hit 85%, a level not seen in decades. This is the equivalent of a pilot noticing the plane is on fire and responding by turning off the fire extinguishers and adding more fuel. It's not just incompetent, it's economic arson. 3. The death spiral, when your currency becomes toilet paper. Let's talk about what 85% inflation actually means for normal people. Meat became a luxury. Bilal, a factory worker, told reporters he couldn't afford meat for an entire year. Cooking oil that used to cost 49 lira jumped to 170 lira in a few months. Teachers, doctors, engineers, The educated middle class saw their savings evaporate overnight. And here's the truly dystopian part. Turks stopped trusting their own currency. A phenomenon called dollarization took over. By September 2025, 58% of all bank deposits in Turkey were in foreign currency, dollars, euros, gold, up from 51% at the start of the year. Think about that. More than half of the money in Turkish banks isn't even in lira. Why? Because holding lira is financial suicide. If you keep your savings in lira, you lose 30-40% of your purchasing power every year. So Turkish grandmothers are lining up at currency exchange offices in the Grand Bazaar, converting every lira they can into dollars. One exchange office owner put it perfectly. People buy lira because they need to spend it, but they buy dollars to invest and guarantee their savings. This creates a death spiral. The more people flee the lira, the weaker it gets. The weaker it gets, the more people flee. The lira lost over 80% of its value against the dollar between 2018 and 2025. In 2018, $1 bought you 4 lira. Today, over 42 lira. Turkey essentially removed 6 zeros from its currency in 2005 because it had become so worthless. The Guinness Book of Records literally ranked the Turkish lira as the world's least valuable currency in the 1990s and 2000s. And now, 2 decades later, history is repeating itself. 4. The brain drain. When the smart people leave. Here's where it gets really ugly. When your economy collapses, the most talented people bail. 400 doctors left Turkey in 2023 alone. These aren't random doctors. These are specialists, surgeons, the people who took years to train. They're fleeing to Germany, the UK, anywhere that pays them a salary that isn't immediately destroyed by inflation. Why? Because a doctor's salary in Turkey is now close to minimum wage. After spending a decade in medical school, they're earning barely enough to survive, and most of them have no intention of coming back. The same is happening with engineers, software developers, academics. Turkey is hemorrhaging human capital. The future of the country is getting on planes and not coming back. And you can't blame them. When your paycheck loses value every month, when you can't save for a house or a car or your kid's education because inflation eats everything, what are you supposed to do? Stay and suffer? 5. The U-turn. When reality finally bites by May 2023, even Erdogan couldn't ignore reality anymore. The lira was in freefall. Inflation was at 85%. The economy was on the brink of collapse. Turkey was becoming an international joke. So, after winning re-election, Erdogan did something shocking. He blinked. He appointed Mehmet Şimşek, a respected Orthodox economist, as finance minister. He installed Hafizagay Erkan and later Fatih Karahan as central bank governors, and he let them do the unthinkable, raise interest rates. From 8.5% in mid-2023, rates skyrocketed to 50% by March 2024. Yes, 50%, the highest in Turkey's modern history. And guess what? It started working. Inflation began to fall. From 85% in late 2022, it dropped to around 31 to 33% by late 2025. The lira stabilized. Foreign reserves started rebuilding. But here's the bitter irony. Erdogan still won't admit he was wrong. In private meetings with his party, he reportedly said, "I haven't changed my mind about interest rates." He still believes high rates cause inflation. He's just tolerating the orthodox policy for now. This is like a smoker who finally quits after getting lung cancer but still insists cigarettes are healthy. The damage is done. The credibility is shattered. 6. The aftermath, counting the cost. So where does that leave Turkey in late 2025? Inflation, down to 31%, but still one of the highest in the world. Interest rates, 38 to 40%, among the highest globally. The lira, still losing value, down 21% in the past year alone. Cost of living, rent has doubled or tripled in major cities. Food prices are up 70% year on year. Minimum wage increases don't even come close to matching inflation. Trust, gone. Turks are holding dollars and gold, not lira. Growth, the economy is growing at 3%, but it's fragile, built on sand. The Turkish people are exhausted. There's a teacher interviewed by CNN who laughed when asked what currency she keeps her savings in. "I can't keep anything, I can't save," she said. Her paycheck goes to paying the interest on her credit card, which she then uses to buy groceries for that month, a never-ending cycle of debt. This is what happens when ideology trumps economics, when conspiracy theories replace central banking, When a leader surrounds himself with yes men who are too afraid to tell him he's driving the country off a cliff. 7. The lesson. What the rest of the world should learn. Turkey wanted to be different. Erdogan promised that low interest rates would lead to growth, jobs, and prosperity. He said the experts were wrong. He said the West was conspiring against him. Instead, Turkey became a cautionary tale. Developing countries looking at Turkey aren't thinking, we should try that. They're thinking, let's do the exact opposite. You cannot fight inflation by cutting interest rates. You cannot build a modern economy on conspiracy theories. You cannot fire every competent person in the central bank and expect good results. Turkey spent years learning this lesson the hard way. Inflation destroyed savings. The currency collapsed. The educated fled. And now, even with orthodox policies, the scars will take decades to heal. The Turkish lira has lost 80% of its value. Households are drowning in debt. The middle class has been gutted. Erdogan wanted to prove the economists wrong. Instead, he proved them right, in the most expensive way possible. Final thoughts. Is there hope for Turkey? Maybe. Şimşek and the new central bank team are doing the right things. Rates are high, inflation is falling, reserves are rebuilding, but trust takes years to build and seconds to destroy. Turkish citizens don't believe in the lira anymore, and who can blame them? The lesson for the rest of us is clear. Economics isn't a religion, it's a science. You can't pray inflation away, you can't wish away currency crises, and you definitely can't run a modern economy based on what your religious texts say about usury. Turkey spent $500 billion learning this lesson. Let's hope the rest of the world can learn it for free. 8. The parallel universe. What if Erdogan had listened? Okay, let's play a game. Let's imagine an alternate timeline. A universe where Erdogan didn't fire his central bank governors, where he actually listened to economists instead of conspiracy theories. What would Turkey look like today? Buckle up, because this is where it gets really painful. The 2018 fork in the road, remember 2018? That's when the lira started its free fall. Inflation was climbing. The central bank wanted to raise rates aggressively. Erdogan said no. But imagine he said yes. Imagine Turkey's central bank had been allowed to do its job, just like its peers in other emerging markets. Look at Chile, look at Brazil, look at Poland. These countries faced the exact same global shocks Turkey did. COVID, supply chain chaos, energy price spikes. But you know what they did differently? They let their central banks act independently. When inflation started rising in 2021, Brazil's central bank didn't wait for permission. They raised rates in the spring of 2021, months before the U.S. Federal Reserve even acknowledged inflation was a problem. Chile followed, Mexico followed, Poland followed. These countries were so aggressive, so decisive, that by 2023-2024, while the Fed and ECB were still fighting inflation, the emerging markets had already won. They brought inflation down faster with less economic damage because they acted early. The Brazilian miracle that Turkey could have had. Let's zoom in on Brazil. In 2016, Brazil was a mess. Political chaos, corruption scandals. Sound familiar? But they did something Turkey didn't. They granted their central bank legal independence in 2021. What happened? When inflation spiked during COVID, Brazil's central bank raised rates from 2% in early 2021 to 13.75% by August 2022. Brutal, right? It hurt, but it worked. By 2024, Brazil's inflation was back under control. Their currency stabilized. Foreign investors came back. And most importantly, Brazilians didn't lose faith in their own currency. Turkish citizens are buying dollars because they don't trust the lira. Brazilian citizens kept using the real because their central bank earned their trust. The numbers don't lie, the road not taken. If Turkey had followed orthodox monetary policy starting in 2018, here's what would have happened. 1. The lira would be worth 2-3x more. Instead of 42 lira to the dollar, Turkey would likely be at 15-20 lira to the dollar. That's not wishful thinking. That's what happened to countries that raised rates early and defended their currencies. 2. Inflation would be at 10-15%, not 30-40%. Chile's inflation peaked at around 14% during the global spike. Poland hit 18%. Turkey hit 85%. The difference? Central bank independence. 3. The middle class would still exist. Doctors wouldn't be fleeing to Germany. Teachers wouldn't be working 2 jobs. Families wouldn't be choosing between meat and rent. Real wages would have held their value. 4. Foreign investment would be flooding, and instead of burning reserves to prop up the lira, Turkey would be attracting capital. Why? Because investors trust countries where central banks can do their jobs without getting fired. 5. Turkey would be a success story, not a warning. Turkey would be in the same conversation as Poland, Chile, and the Czech Republic, emerging markets that did it right. Instead, Turkey is grouped with Argentina and Venezuela. The Poland comparison. Same starting point, different outcome. Here's the really cruel part. In the 1990s, Poland and Turkey were in similar positions. Both were emerging markets. Both had inflation problems. Both were joining the global economy. Poland granted its central bank independence. Turkey did the opposite under Erdogan. Today, Poland's inflation is around 5%. Their currency, the zloty, is stable. Their economy is growing. Foreign companies are building factories there. Turkey's inflation is 31% and falling from 85%. The lira is worthless. Companies are leaving, not arriving. The cost? Poland followed boring conventional economics. Turkey followed Erdoganomics. What about the pain? But wait, I hear you saying. Raising rates to 50% hurts. Look at how painful it is for Turkey now. You're absolutely right. It hurts. But here's the thing. Turkey is feeling that pain anyway, plus 7 years of additional damage. If Turkey had raised rates to 20 to 25% back in 2018 when they should have, yes, it would have caused a recession. Growth would have slowed. Unemployment might have ticked up. But you know what wouldn't have happened? The lira wouldn't have lost 80% of its value. Savings wouldn't have been wiped out. 1-400 doctors wouldn't have left the country. Turkish families wouldn't have lost 7 years of prosperity. Brazil did the hard thing early. It hurt for 18 months. Then it was over. Turkey avoided the hard thing for 7 years. Now they're doing it anyway, except the hole is 10 times deeper and the ladder out is broken. The credibility you can't buy back. Here's the darkest part of this alternate history exercise. Even if Turkey does everything right from here on out, even if Şimşek and Karahan are allowed to finish the job, there's something they can't get back: credibility. Chilean citizens trust their central bank because it's been independent and effective for 25 years. When Chile's central bank says inflation will be 3%, people believe them. They plan their lives around it. Turkish citizens? They're buying dollars and gold because they've learned the hard way: never trust the lira. That trust takes decades to build. Erdogan destroyed it in less than 5 years. And you can't just print credibility the way you print currency. The $500 billion question? Germany wasted $500 billion on its energy transition disaster. Turkey wasted something even more valuable: the economic potential of an entire generation. Think about the opportunities lost. The businesses that never got started because financing was too expensive. The young people who emigrated because there was no future. The investments that went to Poland or Chile instead of Istanbul. If Erdogan had simply done what every Economics 101 textbook says to do, if he had let the central bank raise rates when inflation appeared, Turkey would be a completely different country today. The GDP would be larger. The middle class would be thriving. Istanbul would be a magnet for talent and capital, not a city people are trying to escape. Instead, Turkey became the world's most expensive example of what happens when you let ideology override mathematics. The lesson is written in blood and lira. Countries like Chile, Brazil, Poland, and the Czech Republic looked at the same textbook Turkey did. They read the chapter on central bank independence. They read the part about fighting inflation with higher rates. And they followed the instructions. Turkey threw the textbook in the trash, called it a Western conspiracy, and made up its own rules. Guess who's richer today? The tragic irony is that Turkey had the playbook. In 2001, after a devastating financial crisis, Turkey implemented reforms, granted the central bank more independence, and experienced a decade of spectacular growth. Erdogan himself benefited from those reforms when he came to power. Then he decided he knew better than the experts, better than history, better than every economist on earth. And here we are, Turkey, standing in the ruins of what could have been, looking across at Poland and Chile and Brazil and saying, that could have been us. If you made it this far, you understand something most people don't. Economics isn't optional. Gravity doesn't care if you believe in it. Inflation doesn't care about your political ideology. And currencies don't care about conspiracy theories. Turkey learned this the hard way. Let's hope the rest of us are smart enough to learn from their mistake. Hit that subscribe button if you want more breakdowns of economic disasters. And let me know in the comments, do you think any country will make the same mistake Turkey did, or has the lesson been learned? See you in the next one.